They found the last cartographer's boots hanging from a tree branch, still laced, as if he'd simply vanished from inside them. I heard this story in a Philadelphia tavern 3 weeks before my own assignment began, told by a trapper with shaking hands who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. The other men laughed it off as frontier superstition, but I noticed how they all ordered another round immediately after, how the laughter died too quickly in the smoky air. My name is Thomas Whitaker, and in the spring of 1781, I was 26 years old, freshly certified by the Continental Congress as a surveyor and cartographer. The war with Britain still raged in pockets along the coast, but the Western Territories demanded attention. New settlements needed maps, trade routes required documentation, and the fledgling government wanted to know exactly what land they were fighting for. Before continuing, check right now. If you're already subscribed to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from, I want to see if there's someone from my city here. The assignment seemed straightforward enough. I was to travel west from Philadelphia into the Pennsylvania wilderness, mapping the valleys and ridges that stretched toward the Ohio Territory. The Continental Army needed supply routes, and settlers needed to know where they could safely establish farms and villages. My predecessor, a man named Jonathan Ellis, had been working on the same project 6 months earlier. His work had simply stopped. No body was ever found, just those boots, and his surveying equipment scattered across a clearing as though dropped in haste. The official report called it an animal attack, possibly a bear. But the trapper in the tavern, a man named Silas, who'd found Ellis's camp, swore there were no claw marks, no blood, no signs of a struggle at all. Just gone, Silas had whispered, his weathered face gray in the candlelight, like the land itself swallowed him whole. And the tracks leading away from that camp, they weren't bear tracks, Mr. Whitaker. They were human, bare feet, dozens of them, all around his tent, like they'd been watching him sleep. I departed Philadelphia on a cold April morning, the sky the color of old pewter. My horse, a reliable mare named Constance, carried my surveying equipment, camping supplies, and enough provisions for 6 weeks. I had Ellis's incomplete maps, which showed the first 40 miles of territory in meticulous detail before simply ending at a place marked only with a question mark and the words Folers Valley. The first week of travel passed without incident. I followed established trails, stayed in small settlements at night, and made steady progress westward. The spring rains had been heavy, and the forests were alive with new growth. Dogwood blossoms dotted the understory like snow, and the creeks ran fast and clear with snowmelt from the distant mountains. But as I pushed deeper into unmapped territory, I began to notice changes. The settlements grew smaller and more wary. People who had been friendly and talkative in the eastern villages became guarded and brief in their answers. When I mentioned I was heading toward the territory marked on my map, conversations would die mid-sentence. It was in a settlement called Redemption Creek, barely a dozen cabins clustered around a crude church, that I first heard the name Folers spoken aloud. The minister, a gaunt man named Reverend Hutchins with eyes that seemed to look through rather than at you, invited me to share his evening meal. His wife served venison stew in silence, her hands trembling slightly as she ladled the food into wooden bowls. Their 2 children, a boy and a girl, ate quickly and excused themselves without speaking. "You're the surveyor," Hutchins said. It wasn't a question. "I am. Thomas Whitaker, commissioned by Congress to map the Western Territories. You're following Ellis's route." Again, not a question. I nodded, spooning the stew. It was good, rich with wild onions and herbs, but I noticed the Reverend wasn't eating. "Ellis is dead," Hutchins said flatly. "They took him." "Who took him?" The Reverend's jaw worked as though chewing on words too bitter to swallow. "The Folers, the family in the valley. They've been there since before the first settlements, before William Penn himself set foot in this territory. They were here when this was still wilderness, and they've never left. A family, in the wilderness. Surely they must trade with settlements, come to town for supplies." "No," Hutchins shook his head slowly. They want nothing from us. They take what they need from the land and from travelers foolish enough to venture too close. They've been isolated so long, they're not even human anymore. Not in any way that matters. I set down my spoon, my appetite fading. That's quite an accusation, Reverend. What evidence do you have? 20 years ago, a group of settlers tried to establish a homestead in that valley. Good Christian families, 7 in all. They built cabins, cleared land, planted crops. We sent supplies with them, helped them get started. His voice grew hollow. 3 months later, a boy stumbled into Redemption Creek. He was 10 years old, covered in filth, half-starved, unable to speak. His tongue had been cut out. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Outside, an owl called, the sound mournful and distant. When he could write, he told us what happened. The Folers came in the night, all of them, men and women and children. They surrounded the cabins. They didn't attack at first, just watched. Stood in the darkness, dozens of them, completely silent. The settlers barricaded themselves inside, loaded their muskets. But the Folers didn't leave. They stayed for 3 days and 3 nights, never moving, never speaking, just watching. On the 4th night, the settlers' water ran out. When they tried to make a run for the creek, the Folers were waiting. They killed the adults quickly, but they took the children. This boy only escaped because his father threw him into a root cellar and piled furniture over the door before they broke into the cabin. I felt a chill despite the warm fire. And no one went to investigate, to recover the bodies. We sent a militia, 20 armed men. They found the cabins burned, bodies arranged in patterns in the clearing, symbols we didn't recognize, made from bones and belongings. The militiamen tried to enter the valley proper, but the forest itself seemed to resist them. Trees grown so dense you couldn't see 10 feet ahead. Ravines opening up where the maps showed flat ground. And always the feeling of being watched, of something moving parallel to them in the undergrowth. Hutchins finally met my eyes. They made it 2 miles into the valley before they turned back. The leader of the militia, a brave man named Porter. He told me later that he'd fought in the war, seen men die in terrible ways. But nothing compared to the wrongness he felt in that valley. He said the very air tasted like corruption. 2 of his men never made it back. They were there one moment, walking in the middle of the group, and then they were simply gone. No sound. No struggle. The others searched for hours but found nothing. When they finally retreated, they heard laughter following them through the trees. Children's laughter. I spent a sleepless night in the Reverend's spare room, listening to the forest sounds outside the window and thinking about Ellis's empty boots swaying in the wind. Every rational part of my mind rejected Hutchins's story as frontier paranoia, the kind of superstitious fear that arose in isolated communities. And yet something in his haunted eyes, in the trembling hands of his wife, spoke of genuine terror. In the morning, I prepared to continue my journey. Hutchins watched me pack my equipment onto Constance with an expression of profound sadness. "You won't turn back," he said. "I have a job to do, Reverend. Maps to make. The Congress is depending on my work." Ellis said the same thing. Hutchins reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden cross on a leather cord. "Take this. I don't know if it will help, but it's all I can offer." I accepted it, more to be polite than from any belief in its protective power. "Thank you, Reverend. I'll be careful." "Careful won't be enough," he said quietly, "but I'll pray for you anyway." The trail leading west from Redemption Creek was well maintained for the first few miles, then deteriorated rapidly. By midday, I was following what could barely be called a path, more of a deer trail that wound through increasingly dense forest. The character of the woods had changed. The cheerful spring growth of the earlier territories gave way to something older, darker. The trees here were massive oaks and chestnuts, their canopies so thick that even at noon the forest floor was twilit and still. I consulted Ellis's maps frequently. His notations became more hurried and less detailed as they approached the valley. On the last page, he'd written in cramped handwriting along the margin, The trees have faces. I know it sounds mad, but I swear in the bark, in the patterns of the growth, they look like they're screaming. I studied the trees around me with new unease. In the twisted bark and knotted wood, I could see what Ellis meant. Patterns that suggested tormented faces, mouths open in silent agony. I told myself it was pareidolia, the human tendency to see faces in random patterns. But the impression was unsettling nonetheless. As the afternoon wore on, I became aware of a smell carried on the wind. Not the clean scent of forest and earth, but something else. Something organic and wrong. Like meat left too long in the sun, mixed with the metallic tang of old blood and something sickeningly sweet underneath it all. Constance grew increasingly nervous, her ears flat against her head, nostrils flaring. I had to coax her forward step by step. Animals had instincts humans had lost, I knew. If she was afraid, there was probably good reason. The forest opened suddenly into a clearing, and I pulled Constance to a halt, my breath catching in my throat. Before me stood a structure unlike anything I'd seen in my travels. It could barely be called a house, more of an organic growth that happened to have walls and a roof. The frame was logs, but built into and around a massive dead oak that stood at its center. Bones were woven into the construction, animal and human, bleached white by weather and time. Symbols were carved everywhere, crude and disturbing, spirals and geometric patterns that seemed to twist and crawl at the edges of my vision. Hanging from the eaves were objects that took me several long moments to identify. Clothing. Dozens of articles of clothing, from children's dresses to men's coats, all weather-beaten and torn. Among them swayed pairs of boots, including, I realized with a surge of cold horror, a pair that matched the description of Jonathan Ellis's surveying boots. I should have turned back then. Every instinct screamed at me to wheel Constance around and ride hard for Redemption Creek. But something held me there. A professional curiosity, perhaps, or a stubborn refusal to be driven off by fear. I was a man of science and reason, educated in Philadelphia's finest institutions. I would not be cowed by frontier superstition. I dismounted, tying Constance to a tree at the edge of the clearing. She pulled against the rope, eyes rolling white, but I secured her firmly. Taking my surveying compass and notebook, I approached the structure cautiously. The door stood open, not ajar, but wide open, as if inviting entry. The smell was stronger here, overpowering, and I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. In the dirt around the threshold I saw footprints. Bare feet, as Silas had described. But the proportions were wrong. Some were far too large, the toes splayed unnaturally wide. Others were tiny, like a child's, but with an extra toe pressed into the dirt. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone home? I'm a surveyor, sent by the Continental Congress. I mean, no harm." The only answer was the wind sighing through the dead oak and the creak of the hanging clothes and boots swaying on their ropes. Against all better judgment, I stepped through the doorway. The interior was dim, lit only by the grey light filtering through gaps in the walls. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that every surface was covered in writing, scratched into the wood, carved into the bones that formed supports, written in what looked like dried blood on strips of leather. The same words repeated over and over in a mad litany: "Keep the blood pure. Keep the blood strong. We are the chosen. We are the preserved." A crude table occupied the center of the room, and on it lay objects that made my skin crawl. A collection of teeth, human teeth, sorted by size into neat piles. Locks of hair bound with sinew. Jars containing things floating in murky liquid that I couldn't and didn't want to identify. And there, half hidden beneath a rotting cloth, I saw Ellis's surveying compass. I recognized it immediately by the brass fittings and the initials J.E. engraved on the case. I reached for it, my hand trembling, and as my fingers closed around the cool metal, I heard it, humming. Soft, melodic, coming from somewhere deeper in the structure. A woman's voice, or perhaps a girl's, singing a tune I'd never heard. The melody was strange, with intervals that seemed almost but not quite familiar, as though it came from a tradition of music entirely separate from any I knew. "Hello?" I called again, my voice cracking slightly. "I'm not here to harm you, I just want to talk." The humming stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, I heard breathing, not from one direction, but from all around me. Slow, steady breathing, as if the walls themselves were alive. Then came the whisper, so soft I almost missed it. "Cartographer." The word slithered through the darkness like something with scales. "Yes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm a cartographer. I'm mapping this territory." Ellis mapped. Ellis saw. Ellis knew too much. The voice came from everywhere and nowhere. Multiple voices, I realized, overlapping slightly, speaking in unison but not quite synchronized. The effect was deeply unsettling. What happened to Ellis? Ellis fed the soil. Ellis joined the valley. Ellis is ours now, like all the others who come too close. I backed toward the door, clutching Ellis's compass. "I'll leave. I'll go back and tell them the valley is unmappable. No one else will come." Laughter erupted from the darkness, high-pitched and childlike, but with an edge of cruelty that made my blood run cold. "Liar. More will come. They always come. The outside world pushes and pushes, wanting what isn't theirs, but the valley remembers, the family remembers. We keep the old ways. We keep the blood pure." I reached the threshold and stumbled backward into the clearing, my heart hammering. The voices followed me, growing louder, more numerous. I could see nothing in the darkness of the structure, but I felt eyes on me, dozens of eyes, watching from the shadows. "Run, cartographer. Run fast and run far. Tell them about the Folers. Tell them about the valley that doesn't forget. Tell them what happens to those who trespass on sacred ground." I didn't need to be told twice. I ran for Constance, fumbling with her rope as she stamped and pulled frantically. The moment I had her free, I mounted and kicked her into a gallop. We fled that clearing as if pursued by demons, crashing through underbrush and low-hanging branches. Behind us, the laughter continued, echoing through the trees, coming from ahead of us as much as behind, as if the forest itself was in on the joke. We rode for hours, not stopping until full darkness forced me to make camp. I built the fire larger than necessary, burning through precious wood to keep the flames high and bright. Every sound in the darkness made me jump. Every shifting shadow looked like a human figure standing just beyond the light. I examined Ellis's compass in the firelight. It was damaged, the glass cracked, the needle spinning aimlessly. But on the back, someone had scratched a message with a sharp stone or knife. "They're not human anymore. God forgive me, I should have warned someone. Don't let them spread." I thought about turning back. Returning to Philadelphia, reporting that the territory was too dangerous to map, that Ellis had been killed by hostile natives or wild animals. Anything but the truth of what I'd found. But as I sat by that fire, feeling the weight of Reverend Hutchins's cross around my neck, I realized something that chilled me more than the night air. If the Folers were real, if they were as dangerous as the stories suggested, then someone needed to know, someone needed to document the threat. And if they were isolated to that valley, if they could be contained there, then perhaps others could be warned, protected. I was a cartographer. My job was to map the unknown. And I'd just discovered something that desperately needed mapping before anyone else stumbled into it, unaware. As the fire burned low and exhaustion finally began to overcome fear, I made my decision. I would map the valley. I would learn everything I could about the Folers. And I would survive to bring that knowledge back to civilization, no matter what it took. In the darkness beyond my campfire, something moved through the trees. I caught glimpses of pale shapes flitting between the trunks, keeping pace with the perimeter of my light. Watching. Waiting, counting on fear to drive me away. But I had been afraid before, and I had learned that fear could be a tool. It could make you careful, make you smart. The key was not to let it paralyze you. I fed the fire and kept my knife close. Tomorrow, I would begin a proper survey of the valley's perimeter. I would map the Folers' territory, understand its boundaries, learn its secrets. And I would discover that some secrets are kept for very good reasons. Dawn broke cold and grey, with fog clinging to the forest floor like something living. I'd barely slept, starting awake at every sound, convinced I saw faces in the darkness beyond my fire. But morning brought a measure of rationality back to my thoughts. In daylight, the terrors of the previous evening seemed less immediate, though no less real. I broke camp quickly, eating a cold breakfast of dried meat and hardtack, while studying the maps I'd begun to sketch. My plan was to circle the valley at a safe distance, mapping its boundaries and noting any structures or signs of habitation. I would observe from a distance, gather information without direct confrontation. Knowledge was power, and I was determined to understand what I was dealing with. The terrain grew more difficult as I worked my way north, following what seemed to be the natural boundary of the valley. The land here was ancient, carved by water and time into a maze of ravines and ridges. Streams appeared and disappeared into the earth without warning. Rock formations jutted up at odd angles, as if the bones of the earth itself had been broken and badly set. I noticed something else as well. The wildlife was wrong. I saw birds, but they were silent, flying without the calls and songs that normally filled a forest. The few deer I spotted moved nervously, their heads constantly turning as if expecting attack from any direction. And there were bones everywhere. Not fresh kills, but old bones, scattered across the forest floor in quantities that suggested something more than natural predation. By midday, I'd climbed to a ridge that overlooked a portion of the valley. I set up my surveying equipment and pulled out my spyglass, carefully scanning the terrain below. What I saw made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped the glass. The valley wasn't empty. It was dotted with structures, dozens of them, built in the same horrifying style as the first house I'd encountered. Some were larger, communal buildings perhaps, while others were smaller, barely more than lean-tos constructed from logs and bones. Smoke rose from several locations, thin grey columns that seemed to writhe as they climbed into the sky. But it was the people that froze my blood. They moved through the valley in groups, and even at this distance, I could see that Reverend Hutchins hadn't been exaggerating. Their forms were wrong. Some were hunched and twisted, their spines curved at unnatural angles. Others moved with a lurching gait, as if their legs were different lengths. I saw one figure, impossible to determine if it was male or female, whose arms hung nearly to its knees. Children ran between the buildings, and their laughter carried up to my ridge even over the distance. But their play was disturbing. They chased each other with knives, tumbling and wrestling with a violence that would have left normal children injured or dead. Yet they simply got up, laughing, and continued their games. I watched a group of adults working on something in a central clearing. They appeared to be butchering an animal, though the carcass was too large to be a deer. As I focused my spyglass, my stomach turned. The proportions were wrong for any common game animal. The limbs were too long, the joints bent the wrong way. It was a horse, and I recognized the distinctive white blaze on its face. Constance. I spun around, my heart lurching. The mare was gone. The rope I'd tied her with lay in the dirt, not broken but carefully unknotted. How long had she been gone? Had I been so focused on my observations that I'd missed her being taken? Or had something quietly untied her and led her away while I watched the valley? I swept the area with my eyes, hand on my knife. The forest seemed empty, but I no longer trusted appearances. I began gathering my equipment, moving quickly but trying to remain quiet. I needed to leave this ridge, get back to more open ground where I could see anything approaching. As I packed my surveying tools, I noticed something I'd missed before. Carved into a nearby tree trunk was a message, the letters crude but clear. They know you're here. The carving was fresh, sap still oozed from the cuts in the bark. I ran. Without a horse, laden with equipment, I couldn't move fast. But fear gave me energy I didn't know I had. I crashed through the underbrush, following a deer trail that led roughly east, away from the valley. Behind me, I heard sounds. Not pursuit exactly, but movement, parallel to my path, keeping pace. Sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind, but always there. They were herding me. I realized it after an hour of panicked flight. Every time I tried to turn south or north, the sounds would intensify in that direction, driving me back onto the eastern path. They wanted me to go this way, and that terrified me more than direct pursuit would have. The sun was high when the trail opened into another clearing. I stumbled into it, breathing hard, my legs burning from exertion, and stopped dead. This clearing was different from the one I'd found the day before. It was larger, more deliberate in its construction. The ground had been cleared and flattened, and in the center stood a structure that might once have been a church. The building was stone, ancient fieldstone laid without mortar, held together by time and perhaps something else. The roof had long since collapsed, leaving only walls and the skeleton of a bell tower. But what covered those walls made me want to close my eyes and pretend I'd never seen it. Bones. Human bones. Thousands of them, arranged in intricate patterns across the stone. Skulls formed borders and spirals. Femurs created geometric designs. Smaller bones spelled out words in a language I didn't recognize, though the characters looked vaguely like corrupted Latin. And in the center of the clearing, rising from the ground like a grotesque monument, was a tree unlike any I'd seen. It was dead, its bark black and weeping some kind of resinous substance, but attached to its branches were objects that had once been human. Not bodies, not anymore. They'd been preserved somehow, dried and twisted into shapes that seemed designed to cause maximum horror to any viewer. I recognized clothing on some of them. Styles from 50 years ago, 100 years ago, even older. How long had the Folers been doing this? How many had died in this valley? "Beautiful, isn't it?" The voice came from behind me and I spun, my knife appearing in my hand as if by instinct. A woman stood at the edge of the clearing. At least, I assumed it was a woman from the dress she wore, though the garment was so tattered and stained it was hard to be certain. Her hair hung in matted ropes around a face that was almost normal. Almost. Her eyes were too far apart, giving her features an unsettling fish-like quality. When she smiled, I saw that her teeth were filed to points. "I'm Sarah," she said, her voice surprisingly cultured, with none of the backwoods accent I'd expected. "Sarah Fowler. You've been very busy, cartographer, mapping our home without permission." "I mean no harm," I said, keeping the knife between us. "I'm just doing my job." "Your job." She laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your job is theft. You come to steal our land with your maps and your measurements. You think if you draw lines on paper, you can claim what has been ours for generations. This land belongs to the Continental Congress, to America, to the people. This land belongs to itself," Sarah said, her smile fading. "And to those who understand it. We were here before your Congress, before your America, before the colonies that thought they could tame the wilderness. We've been here since the beginning, and we'll be here long after your nations have crumbled to dust." She began walking toward me, her movements fluid but somehow wrong, as if she had too many joints in her legs. "We've kept the old ways alive, the true ways. We haven't diluted ourselves with outsider blood, haven't softened our faith with modern conveniences and compromises. We are pure. We are what humanity was meant to be." "You're inbred," I said bluntly. "What you're doing is creating deformities, weakness, madness." Her smile returned, wider now, showing more of those sharpened teeth. "Is that what your science tells you? That diversity is strength? We know better. We know that careful cultivation, proper selection, creates something stronger than nature alone ever could. Every generation, we become more perfect, more suited to this place, more connected to the land. You're killing travelers, taking people who stumble into your territory. Harvesting, she corrected. We harvest what the land provides. Sometimes it provides deer or bear, sometimes it provides wanderers who don't belong. Everything in the valley serves a purpose, cartographer. Even you. I backed away, but she matched my movement with casual ease. The others wanted to kill you yesterday, after you entered the breeding house. But I convinced them you could serve a better purpose. You can carry a message back to your Congress, to your settlements. Tell them what awaits anyone who tries to claim this valley. Tell them about the Folers. Why? Why let me go when you killed Ellis? Ellis tried to fight. Ellis drew a weapon and killed one of the children. For that, he had to be made an example. Her expression hardened. You haven't shed Foler blood yet, so you get a chance to leave. Once, only once. If anyone comes back, if any more surveyors or soldiers or settlers try to enter our territory, we will paint these trees with their remains. She gestured to the forest around us, and I realized with creeping horror that faces were emerging from the shadows. Dozens of them. Men, women, children, all bearing the marks of generations of inbreeding. Twisted limbs, malformed features, eyes that reflected light like an animal's. They stood silent, watching, waiting. Go, Sarah said softly. Take your maps and your tools and run back to your civilized world. Tell them the valley is cursed, haunted, impossible to settle. We don't care what story you tell, as long as they stay away. This is our land, our territory, and we protect what's ours. I didn't need further encouragement. I fled that clearing, leaving most of my equipment behind, caring only about the rough maps I'd sketched and the observations I'd recorded. The Folers didn't pursue me, but I felt their eyes on my back every step of the way. I walked for the rest of that day and through the night, not stopping even when exhaustion made my legs shake and my vision blur. I couldn't get Sarah's face out of my mind, that almost normal appearance that made the wrongness underneath even more disturbing. These weren't monsters in the traditional sense. They were human, or had been once. That made them infinitely more terrifying. By the time I stumbled into Redemption Creek 2 days later, half-starved and delirious from lack of sleep, I'd made a decision. I would report what I'd found. I would tell the authorities about the Folers and their Valley of Horrors, and I would make sure that no one else suffered Ellis's fate. Reverend Hutchins met me at the church, his face grave as he saw my condition. His wife brought water and food while he listened to my story. You were lucky, he said when I'd finished. Luckier than most who go there. But you must understand, Mr. Whitaker, that no one will believe you. We've tried to warn people for decades. They dismiss it as frontier superstition, as tales told to frighten children. Then I'll make them believe, I said. I'll show them my maps, my observations. I'll bring soldiers if necessary. Hutchins shook his head sadly. The last time soldiers went into that valley, 20 years ago, 2 never came back. The government declared the territory too dangerous for development and largely forgot about it. What makes you think it will be different now? Because I have proof, I have evidence, and I'm not going to let fear keep me silent. But even as I said the words, I wondered if I was being naive. Could maps and testimonies really convince anyone of what I'd seen? Would anyone believe that an entire family, possibly hundreds of people, had lived in isolation for generations, becoming something less than human in the process? I spent a week in Redemption Creek, recovering my strength and organizing my notes. Hutchins's wife, Martha, was kind enough to mend my clothes and ensure I ate properly. The Reverend himself spent long hours discussing what I'd learned, adding his own observations and stories from other travelers. They weren't always like this, he told me one evening as we sat by his fire. According to the oldest records, the Folers family came here in the late 1600s, some of the earliest European settlers in the region. They were religious extremists, seeking isolation from the corruption they saw in the colonies. They believed in racial purity, in keeping bloodlines clean, in maintaining traditions that others had abandoned. At first, it was just unusual. They didn't trade, didn't interact with other settlements, but they were peaceful, left alone. Then, sometime around 1700, they stopped being seen altogether. The few people who ventured near their settlement reported strange changes. Buildings constructed from unusual materials, practices that seemed to violate natural law. What changed? I asked. The isolation, Hutchins said. When you have a small group with extreme beliefs, cut off from outside influence with no new blood coming in, both the genes and the ideas become corrupted. Each generation more warped than the last, until you end up with what you found in that valley. He paused, staring into the flames. The truly terrifying part isn't what they are now, it's what they might become if they continue. Another 50 years, another 100 of careful inbreeding and isolation. Evolution run backwards, humanity devolving into something we can't even imagine. That thought haunted me as I prepared to return to Philadelphia. I'd accomplished my mission in the darkest possible way. I had mapped the territory, identified the hazards, documented what awaited any settlers foolish enough to venture into Folers Valley. But I'd also learned that some places couldn't be civilized, couldn't be claimed. Some darkness was too deep to illuminate. The morning I left Redemption Creek, Hutchins walked me to the edge of the settlement. "What will you do with your report?" he asked. "Submit it to Congress. Recommend the area be declared uninhabitable and placed under military restriction. Make sure no one else walks into that horror unprepared. And if they ignore your recommendations, if they decide the land is too valuable to leave unclaimed?" I didn't have an answer for that. We both knew that governments rarely made decisions based on individual reports, especially ones that sounded as fantastic as mine would. But I had to try. "Thank you for your hospitality, Reverend, and your warnings. I should have listened more carefully before I entered that valley." "You listened with your mind," Hutchins said. "But some warnings can only be understood by the heart, after you've felt the wrongness yourself. Go in peace, Mr. Whitaker, and pray that the Folers stay in their valley." As I walked east, following the trail back towards civilization, I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah's words had been more than just a warning. They'd been a promise. The Folers knew about the outside world. They understood that eventually someone would come to claim their territory, and they were preparing for it. Philadelphia welcomed me back with spring warmth and the bustle of a city trying to rebuild while still at war. After weeks in the wilderness, the noise and crowds felt overwhelming, but also reassuring. This was civilization, order, rationality. Everything the Folers Valley wasn't. I spent 3 days writing my official report, carefully organizing my observations and sketches. I included everything I'd witnessed, but I also knew how it would sound. A family of inbred cannibals living in isolated degeneracy, building structures from human remains, hunting travelers for sport. It read like a gothic horror novel, not a governmental survey. I submitted the report to the Continental Congress office in Philadelphia and waited. Days passed, then weeks. When I finally received a summons, it wasn't what I expected. The meeting took place in a small room with 3 officials whose names I was never given. They were older men, dressed well, with the bearing of people accustomed to authority. One of them held my report. "Mr. Whitaker," the eldest began, "your observations are quite disturbing." "They're accurate, sir. Every word." "I'm sure you believe that. But you must understand how this appears. A remote valley inhabited by deformed people practicing barbaric customs. It sounds like the fevered imagination of someone who spent too long alone in the wilderness. I felt anger rising but kept my voice level. I saw what I saw. Ellis saw it too, which is why he's dead. This isn't imagination or exaggeration. Ellis's death was attributed to an animal attack. because the truth was too uncomfortable to acknowledge. The youngest of the three officials spoke up. "Let's assume your report is accurate. What exactly do you propose we do? Send soldiers into difficult terrain to attack American citizens who haven't actually violated any laws? They're murderers. They've killed travelers, settlers. Do you have bodies? Witnesses beyond yourself? Any actual evidence that would hold up in a court of law?" I fell silent. They were right. I had nothing concrete, just observations and circumstantial evidence. The boots, the clothing could have been scavenged. The bones could be from legitimate burials or animal remains. Without bodies, without survivors willing to testify, I had nothing actionable. "However," the eldest official continued, "we do take your concerns seriously. We're prepared to offer you another assignment. Return to the valley with a small military escort. Document everything more thoroughly. Attempt to make contact with these Folers and determine their true intentions. If they are indeed hostile, we'll have grounds for action. You want me to go back? You're the only surveyor who's been there and returned. You know the territory. With proper military support, you'll be safe." I wanted to refuse. Every instinct screamed at me to walk away, to forget the valley and its horrors. But I also knew that if I didn't go back, someone else would eventually, and they might not be as lucky as I'd been. "I'll do it," I said, "but I want this in writing, and I want the soldiers to be volunteers who understand what they're walking into." The officials agreed, though I could see skepticism in their eyes. They thought I was exaggerating, perhaps suffering from some form of wilderness madness. They'd learn. 2 weeks later, I stood at the edge of Redemption Creek with 6 soldiers, all veterans of the Continental Army. I'd briefed them extensively, shown them my sketches and maps. To their credit, they'd listened without mocking, though I could see doubt in their faces. Sergeant Miller, the unit commander, was a scarred veteran in his 40s who'd fought at Saratoga. "Mr. Whitaker," he said as we prepared to enter the forest, "I respect your conviction, but I've seen a lot of strange things in war, and most of them had rational explanations once you got close enough. I expect we'll find an isolated family, probably inbred and primitive, but nothing that 6 armed men can't handle. I hope you're right, Sergeant, but if you're not, promise me you'll retreat. Don't try to be heroes. These people aren't rational enemies you can fight honorably." Miller nodded, though I could tell he thought I was being overly dramatic. We entered the forest in the early morning, following my maps toward the valley. The soldiers moved with military precision, weapons ready, maintaining sight of each other. They were good men, professionals, and they were walking into something no training could prepare them for. The first day passed without incident, though I noticed the forest growing darker and more oppressive as we went deeper. The soldiers noticed it too, their jokes and conversation gradually dying away into tense silence. That night, we made camp in a defensible position, with guards rotating through the darkness. I barely slept, listening to the forest sounds and remembering my last time here. The scream that woke me in the deepest part of night was like nothing human. It tore through the darkness, full of agony and terror, coming from somewhere very close to our camp. We all jumped up, weapons ready, searching the darkness beyond our firelight. The scream came again, and then again, each time from a different direction. It was being repeated by multiple voices, echoing through the forest in a horrible chorus. "Form up," Miller ordered, his earlier confidence replaced by grim focus. "Watch all approaches." But there was nothing to watch. The screams continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse. In the morning, we found a message carved into a tree at the edge of our camp. The same crude letters I'd seen before, but a different warning. "Turn back. This is your only chance." One of the soldiers, a young private named Hayes, was pale and shaking. "Sir, maybe we should listen. This doesn't feel right." "We have orders," Miller said, though even he sounded less certain. We continue until we make contact or encounter direct hostility. Stay alert, stay together, and we'll be fine. We weren't fine. The attacks began in the afternoon. Not direct assaults, but harassment. Rocks thrown from the forest, though we never saw who threw them. Objects left in our path, disturbing constructions of bones and branches that seemed designed to unnerve rather than harm. And always the feeling of being watched, dozens of eyes tracking our every move. By the time we reached the valley's edge, Miller had changed his assessment. "You were right," he said quietly, studying the terrain ahead. "There's something very wrong here." We stood on the same ridge where I'd watched the valley before. The soldiers used their own spyglasses to observe what I'd seen. The structures, the people moving below, the unmistakable wrongness of it all. "How many do you estimate?" Miller asked. "Hard to say. I saw at least 100 individuals during my first observation. Could be more. And they're all hostile. They view anyone entering the valley as a threat or a resource. Based on what Sarah told me, they'll allow us to leave this time. But if we actually enter the valley proper, they'll respond with force." Miller considered this, his jaw tight. "We need to report this, but we also need more information, defensive capabilities, organizational structure, leadership. If Congress decides to take action, we need intelligence." I understood what he was suggesting, but I also knew how dangerous it was. If we push too far, if we cross whatever boundary they've set, they won't let us leave. Then we need to find that boundary. We spent the next 2 days mapping the valley's perimeter, noting access points and defensive positions. The Folers let us work, though we constantly saw them watching from the tree line. They didn't hide anymore. They wanted us to see them, to understand what we were dealing with. On the 3rd day, we encountered something that changed everything. We'd been following a creek that seemed to mark the eastern boundary of Foler territory when Private Hayes called out. He'd found something in the underbrush, partially hidden by leaves and debris. It was a skeleton. Human, but wrong. The bones were malformed, with extra joints in places, the skull elongated and misshapen. Around the neck was a rusted chain with a pendant. A name was engraved on it. Samuel Foler, born 1735. "That would make this person 46 years old when they died," I said, studying the skeleton. "If they died recently," Miller added. "But look at how weathered the bones are. This has been here for years." We found more as we searched the area. Dozens of skeletons, all showing similar deformities. Some were obviously very old, the bones nearly crumbling. Others were more recent. And as we examined them, a horrible pattern emerged. These weren't the remains of the current Folers. These were the failures, the children and adults whose deformities were too severe, who couldn't survive the family's harsh lifestyle. They'd been brought to this place and left to die, or killed outright. "Jesus Christ," Hayes whispered, staring at a tiny skeleton that couldn't have been more than a few years old. "They're killing their own children." "Selection," I said, the pieces falling into place. Sarah said something about becoming more perfect with each generation. "They're not just allowing inbreeding, they're actively selecting for certain traits, culling those who don't meet their standards." Miller looked sick. "That's not just primitive, that's calculated, systematic." "And it's been going on for generations," I added, gesturing to the older remains. "They've been doing this for decades, maybe longer, carefully breeding themselves into whatever they consider ideal." We documented the burial ground thoroughly, sketching the remains and their deformities. This was evidence that couldn't be dismissed. This proved the Folers weren't just an isolated family, but something far more disturbing. As the sun began to set, we prepared to make camp near the burial ground. It seemed defensible, and we'd learned enough for one day. That's when we heard the singing. It started soft, carried on the evening wind. Childlike voices, dozens of them, singing in that strange harmony I'd heard before. The melody wound through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere at once. And then they appeared. Children. Dozens of them, emerging from the forest like ghosts. They ranged in age from perhaps 5 to 15, all bearing the marks of the Folers bloodline. Twisted limbs, unusual features, eyes that caught the firelight and reflected it back with an animal gleam. They didn't approach our camp. They simply stood at the edge of the clearing, forming a circle around us, and sang. The words weren't English or any language I recognized. It might have been corrupted Latin or something older. But the intent was clear. We were surrounded. Miller ordered the men to form a defensive circle, weapons ready. But the children didn't attack. They just sang, their voices rising and falling in eerie harmonies, their eyes never leaving us. "What do we do?" Hayes asked, his voice shaking. Before Miller could answer, an adult appeared. Not Sarah this time, but a man. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders like a bull. His face was surprisingly handsome despite the slightly too wide spacing of his eyes and the extra finger on each hand. "Soldiers," he said, his voice deep and cultured. "You've found our garden, the place where we plant our failures so that stronger growth can flourish. Do you understand now? Do you see what we are?" "We see murder," Miller said firmly. "The killing of children." The man's expression didn't change. "We see husbandry, the careful tending of a bloodline to create something greater. You cull your crops, don't you? Remove the weak plants so the strong can thrive. We do the same with our own. It's not murder, it's responsibility." "You're insane." "We're devoted. There's a difference." He gestured to the children surrounding us. "These are our successes, the ones who passed the trials, who proved their worth. They're stronger than any children in your cities, more connected to the land, more pure in their purpose. And in another generation, they'll be even more perfect." I found my voice. "Perfect for what? What's the end goal of all this?" The man smiled, and it was a terrible thing to see. "Survival, cartographer. When your civilization falls, when your cities burn and your governments collapse, we will remain. We've been preparing for that day since the beginning. We will inherit this land because we've become part of it in ways you never could. This land doesn't belong to you," Miller said. "It belongs to those strong enough to keep it, and we are very, very strong." Without warning, the man moved. One moment he was standing 15 feet away, the next he'd crossed the distance and grabbed one of our soldiers, a man named Porter. The speed was impossible, inhuman. Porter tried to raise his musket, but the Folers man was faster. He lifted Porter by the throat, effortlessly, like lifting a child. "This is what evolution creates," the man said calmly, holding Porter as he struggled and choked. "Your armies, your weapons, mean nothing against bodies bred for this purpose. We are what humanity should have been." Miller fired. The musket ball struck the man in the shoulder, spinning him around but not dropping him. He looked at the wound with almost academic interest, blood streaming down his arm, and smiled. "Interesting. That actually hurt." He dropped Porter, who collapsed, gasping. "I'll remember that." Then he was gone, vanishing into the forest with the same impossible speed. The children followed, melting into the shadows, their singing fading into the night. We picked up Porter, who was bruised but alive, and immediately broke camp. There was no discussion, no debate. We'd gotten our intelligence, and it was far worse than anyone had imagined. The Folers weren't just inbred savages. They were something new. A branch of humanity that had deliberately bred itself for strength, speed, and adaptation to wilderness life. Whatever genetic damage their inbreeding had caused was offset by their ruthless culling of the weak. They were creating a subspecies designed to survive in conditions that would kill normal humans. We retreated through the night, moving as fast as we dared. The Folers followed, but they didn't attack. They simply paced us, letting us know they could strike at any moment but choosing not to. The message was clear. You've been warned. Don't come back. We reached Redemption Creek at dawn, exhausted and shaken. Reverend Hutchins took one look at our faces and knew we'd seen the truth of the valley. "Now you understand," he said simply. Miller nodded, all his earlier skepticism gone. "We need to report this immediately. The government needs to know what's growing in that valley." But as we prepared to return to Philadelphia, I couldn't stop thinking about the Folers man's words. They were preparing for the fall of civilization, breeding themselves into something that could survive anything. The question was, how long had they been doing this? And more terrifyingly, how much further could they evolve? The ride back to Philadelphia gave me time to organize my thoughts and observations. The report I would write this time would be different. Not just a survey of hostile territory, but a warning about a threat unlike anything the young nation had faced. The Folers weren't just defending their land. They were conducting an experiment in human evolution, and they'd had generations to perfect it. Every weakness bred out, every advantage carefully cultivated. They'd chosen isolation not out of fear, but out of purpose. And now, we'd drawn their attention, shown them that eventually the outside world would come for them. What would they do with that knowledge? Wait and prepare? Or would they decide that the best defense was offense? I thought about the children surrounding our camp, their voices raised in that alien song. In another generation, those children would be adults, possibly stronger and more adapted than their parents, and their children would be even more so. How long before the Folers decided that remaining isolated wasn't enough? How long before they decided the best way to preserve their purity was to eliminate everything around them that represented contamination? These questions haunted me during the journey and would continue to haunt me for years to come, because I'd seen something in that valley that no one else seemed to grasp. The Folers weren't a problem that could be ignored or contained. They were a seed of something terrible, growing in the darkness, waiting for the right moment to spread. And I had no idea how to stop it. The second report to Congress was received very differently from the first. With 6 military witnesses corroborating my observations, skepticism turned to alarm. Within a week of our return, I was summoned to a meeting that included not just minor officials, but members of the Continental Congress itself. The meeting took place in an elegant room that seemed far removed from the horrors we'd witnessed. Maps covered the walls, showing the expanding territories of the new nation. These men were planning the future of America, drawing boundaries and allocating lands. And I was about to tell them that part of that future included a family that had been selectively breeding itself into something other than human. "Mr. Whitaker," began a distinguished gentleman I recognized as a delegate from Virginia. "We've read your report and heard testimony from Sergeant Miller. The details are troubling to say the least. But before we discuss action, I need to understand something. You claim these Folers have been deliberately breeding for specific traits. How is that even possible without knowledge of modern science?" I'd anticipated this question. "They don't need to understand genetics, sir. Farmers have been selectively breeding animals for thousands of years without understanding why it works. They simply observe traits they want and breed accordingly. The Folers have been doing the same with themselves. For how long? Based on the remains we've found, at least 80 years, possibly longer." Murmurs rippled through the room. Another delegate spoke up. "And you believe they pose a genuine threat to settlements in the region?" "I believe they will, sir. Right now they're content to remain isolated, but we've shown them that isolation can't last forever. Eventually, the expanding nation will encroach on their territory. When that happens, they won't simply relocate, they'll fight." "One family against a nation?" The Virginia delegate looked skeptical. Miller, who'd been standing quietly by the wall, spoke up. "With respect, sir, they're not like any enemy you've faced. The man who attacked us moved faster than I thought possible. He took a musket ball to the shoulder and barely reacted. And that's just one adult. They have dozens, possibly hundreds, all bred for physical capability in that environment. They can't stand against artillery, against organized troops. Maybe not in open battle, I said, but they know every inch of that valley. They can disappear into the forest at will. They're organized, intelligent, and absolutely ruthless. This isn't a rabble of primitives. It's a calculated enemy that's been preparing for conflict for generations. The room fell silent as the delegates absorbed this. Finally, one of them asked the question I'd been dreading. "What do you recommend we do?" I took a deep breath. Quarantine the area. Post military guards on all approaches. Make it illegal to enter the valley under penalty of death. Don't try to fight them or drive them out. Just contain them and wait. Wait for what? For them to die out. Inbreeding may have given them strength in some areas, but it also creates genetic problems. Disease susceptibility, shortened lifespans, reduced fertility. If we can keep them isolated and prevent any new blood from entering their population, nature will solve the problem for us. How long would that take? Generations. 50 years, maybe more. But it's better than sending soldiers to die in a valley that gives every advantage to an enemy who knows it intimately. The Virginia delegate shook his head. We can't simply cordon off usable territory for half a century. The nation needs land, needs resources, and we can't set a precedent that any group can claim territory by being sufficiently violent. Then you'll send soldiers to die, I said bluntly, and not just soldiers, settlers, surveyors, traders, anyone who ventures into that region. The Folers have made their position clear. They'll kill anyone who trespasses. Let them try. We have superior numbers, superior weapons, superior organization. I felt frustration rising. These men had spent too long in elegant rooms, making decisions based on maps and reports. They hadn't seen what I'd seen, hadn't felt the wrongness that permeated the valley. Respectfully, sir, you're underestimating them because they don't fit your understanding of an enemy. They're not a foreign army you can negotiate with or a tribe you can intimidate. They're true believers in their own evolution, and they'll die to protect it. The debate continued for hours. Some delegates supported containment, others advocated for military action. Still others suggested attempting diplomacy. I answered questions, showed sketches, provided every detail I could remember. Miller backed me up with his own observations. In the end, the decision was predictably political. The Continental Congress couldn't officially sanction abandoning territory or acknowledging that an American family had successfully seceded from the nation, but they also couldn't ignore the threat entirely. The compromise was typical of governmental bodies. They would increase military patrols in the region, establish a permanent garrison at Redemption Creek, and officially discourage settlement in the immediate vicinity of Foler Valley. But they wouldn't actively blockade it, wouldn't make it illegal to enter, wouldn't take the strong measures I'd recommended. It was, I knew, a disaster waiting to happen. I spent the next month at the Redemption Creek garrison, helping to establish proper defenses and training the soldiers on what to expect. The fort was crude but defensible, positioned on high ground with clear sightlines. 20 soldiers were assigned permanent duty, rotating every 3 months to prevent isolation and its psychological effects. Reverend Hutchins visited frequently, bringing news from nearby settlements and offering spiritual counsel to the soldiers. He'd been fighting this battle longer than any of us, and his earlier resignation had transformed into grim determination. "They're not going to listen until people die," he told me one evening as we sat in his cabin. "That's how it always works. Warnings are ignored until tragedy makes them real. Then we need to make sure we're ready when it happens," I said. "These soldiers need to understand they're not fighting a conventional enemy. Do any of them truly believe? Or do they think we're exaggerating?" I thought about the young men I'd been training, their mix of skepticism and bravado. Some believe, the ones who felt the forest watching them. who've heard sounds at night that don't match any animal they know. But others think we're telling ghost stories. The Folers will educate them, Hutchins said darkly, and the lesson will be written in blood. He was right, of course. The first incident occurred 6 weeks after the garrison was established. A settler family named the Bransons decided they'd heard enough warnings and were more concerned with finding good farmland than with avoiding some supposedly dangerous valley. They were experienced frontiersmen, capable and armed. They ignored advice from the garrison and pushed west with their 2 wagons, 6 children, and dreams of establishing a homestead. We found the wagons 3 days later, after they failed to check in at a planned waypoint. The scene was worse than anything I'd imagined. The Bransons had been arranged, not killed and left where they fell, but deliberately positioned in a tableau that spoke of ritual and purpose. The adults formed a circle around the children, all facing outward, as if protecting them even in death. But the protection had failed. Every member of the family showed signs of prolonged suffering before death. What made it worse was the precision. These weren't savage killings born of rage or hunger. Each wound seemed calculated, designed to prolong agony without causing immediate death. The Folers had taken their time, making sure every moment was agony. And carved into the largest wagon, in crude but readable letters, "This land is ours. Next time we take soldiers." The garrison soldiers who discovered the scene were veterans, men who'd seen the worst of war. But several vomited at the sight, and one simply sat down and wept. This wasn't war as they understood it. This was something else entirely. We brought the bodies back for burial. Reverend Hutchins performed the service, his voice steady despite the horror of what we'd found. The entire garrison attended, their earlier skepticism burned away by the reality of 6 small coffins lined up before the crude altar. That night, as I sat with Miller in the garrison commander's office, we both knew things had changed. "I'm writing to Congress," Miller said, "requesting either significant reinforcements or permission to actively engage the Folers in their valley. We can't just sit here and wait for the next family to be slaughtered." "They'll send more soldiers," I predicted. "But they won't authorize an offensive. Too expensive, too risky, and no political benefit. The Bransons weren't important people. 6 children died. I know. But Congress is fighting a war on multiple fronts. They can't spare significant forces for what they still see as a local problem." Miller slammed his hand on the desk. "How many have to die before it becomes a real problem in their eyes?" I had no answer for that. We both knew the calculus of government rarely aligned with morality or urgency. The response from Congress arrived 2 weeks later. They were sending 50 additional soldiers and authorizing defensive patrols into Foler territory. It was something, but far from what we needed. The new troops arrived in stages over the next month. Most were young, some barely 20, all eager to prove themselves. I gave the same briefing I'd given the original garrison, showed the same sketches, told the same stories. Some listened carefully. Others I could see dismissing my warnings as exaggeration. Among the new arrivals was a lieutenant named Harrison, a capable officer with extensive frontier experience. He'd fought natives in the Carolina backcountry and survived ambushes that killed half his unit. He was brave, skilled, and convinced he understood how to handle any wilderness threat. "Mr. Whitaker," he said after my briefing, "I respect your observations, but I've faced hostile forces in difficult terrain before. With proper tactics and discipline, any enemy can be defeated. This isn't like anything you've faced before, Lieutenant. Every veteran says that about their particular war, but fundamentals remain the same. We'll establish patrol patterns, map their territory in detail, identify their leaders, and systematically reduce their capability to threaten settlers." I wanted to argue, to make him understand that standard military thinking wouldn't work here. But I also recognized the confidence of a man who'd survived impossible situations before and assumed he could do it again. "Be careful, Lieutenant. The Folers have advantages you're not accounting for." I'm always careful, Mr. Whitaker. That's why I'm still alive. Harrison organized his patrols with military precision. Teams of 10 soldiers, well armed and supplied, would enter Folers territory for 3-day reconnaissance missions. They'd map terrain, identify structures, observe activity, and retreat before engaging unless directly attacked. The first 3 patrols went well enough. They encountered signs of the Folers, but no direct contact. They mapped several structures on the valley's periphery and noted what seemed to be agricultural areas where the family was growing crops. The reports were professional and thorough. Then the 4th patrol didn't return. Harrison organized a search party immediately. 20 soldiers, heavily armed, followed the missing patrol's route into the valley. I went with them, despite my misgivings. Someone needed to be there who understood what they were really facing. We found the patrol in a clearing 3 miles from the valley's edge. They'd been killed efficiently, each man with a single throat wound, done so quickly they'd barely had time to react. Their weapons were gone, their supplies taken, and arranged around the clearing were their bodies, positioned to spell out a message visible from the air. No more. Jesus, Harrison whispered, his face ashen. This was different from anything he'd experienced in Carolina. This showed planning, organization, and a level of capability he hadn't expected. They're telling us they're done playing, I said. They let the first patrols go to study us, to learn our patterns and capabilities. Now they're showing us what they can do when they decide to act. We need to withdraw, Harrison said, his earlier confidence shaken. Regroup and plan a proper response. But as we began gathering the bodies, we realized the Folers weren't going to let us leave peacefully. They'd been waiting for this moment, for us to venture deep enough into their territory to make escape difficult. The attack came from all directions, simultaneously, not with muskets or primitive weapons, but with coordinated precision that spoke of extensive planning. The Folers had positioned themselves perfectly, cutting off our retreat while maintaining cover. Harrison's training took over. He organized defensive positions, established firing lines, maintained discipline even as soldiers began falling to thrown weapons and ambush tactics. But it was clear we were outmatched in this environment. Fighting retreat, Harrison ordered. Maintain formation, cover each other, move. We fell back slowly, carrying our dead, fighting every step. The Folers pursued but didn't press too hard, content to harry us and inflict casualties without risking their own people unnecessarily. They knew this terrain intimately, could disappear and reappear at will, struck from unexpected angles. We lost 4 more soldiers in that retreat, wounded too badly to survive the journey back to the garrison. I saw Harrison's face change during that fighting, saw him realize that everything he thought he knew about wilderness combat was inadequate here. We made it back to the garrison with 14 survivors from a force of 22. The casualty rate was devastating, worse than any engagement Harrison had experienced in the Revolution. That night, as we tended to the wounded and prepared the dead for burial, Harrison sat across from me in the dim firelight. "You tried to warn me," he said quietly. "Yes. I didn't listen. I thought I knew better. Thought my experience was enough. Experience only helps if the situation is analogous. This isn't." He looked at the bandage on his arm, where a thrown knife had come within inches of severing an artery. "What do we do now?" "We report honestly to Congress. Tell them that offensive operations are suicide with current resources. Recommend the containment strategy I proposed initially. They won't listen. Probably not. But we have to try." I wrote another report that night, this one jointly signed by Harrison Miller and myself. We detailed everything that had happened, included casualty counts, described the Folers' capabilities in stark terms. We recommended immediate withdrawal of all patrols from Folers territory and establishment of a defensive perimeter that focused solely on protecting nearby settlements. The report was sent, and we waited for a response. It came faster than expected, and it wasn't what we hoped for. Congress was sending more troops. Not 50 this time, but 200. They were authorizing a full military campaign to pacify the Foler Valley. The message was clear: the United States would not allow any group to defy its authority or threaten its citizens. The Folers would be subdued by force. "They're making a mistake," Miller said, reading the orders. "A terrible mistake." I could only nod. Everything I'd feared was coming to pass. The government had decided to treat the Folers as a conventional enemy, to bring superior force to bear and crush resistance. But the Folers weren't conventional, and the valley wasn't standard terrain. This wasn't going to be a military campaign. It was going to be a slaughter. The only question was which side would suffer more. As we prepared for the arrival of the main force, I couldn't stop thinking about Sarah's words from that first encounter. She'd warned me what would happen if soldiers came. She'd told me they would paint the trees with remains. And now, I feared, we were about to learn exactly what that meant. The army arrived in the autumn of 1781, 200 soldiers under the command of Colonel Marcus Thornton, a veteran of multiple campaigns who'd distinguished himself at Yorktown. He was exactly the kind of confident, experienced officer who believed overwhelming force could solve any problem. I met him at the garrison, along with Harrison and Miller. We'd prepared extensive briefings, gathered every piece of intelligence we had, organized our observations into a comprehensive picture of the enemy and terrain. Thornton listened politely, but I could see skepticism in his eyes. He'd fought British regulars, faced trained soldiers with artillery and cavalry support. A family of inbred backwoods people, no matter how dangerous individually, couldn't possibly stand against 200 disciplined troops. "Gentlemen," he said when we'd finished, "I appreciate your warnings, but I've reviewed the casualty reports, and while regrettable, they're within acceptable parameters for frontier operations. A well-organized force with proper support can overcome any enemy, no matter their familiarity with the terrain." "Sir," I said carefully, "with respect, this isn't a typical enemy. The Folers have been preparing for this kind of confrontation for generations. They're not going to meet you in open battle where your advantages matter. Then we'll flush them out, burn the structures, destroy their crops, make the valley uninhabitable. They'll have to surrender or flee. They won't do either. They'll fight to extinction before they leave this valley." Thornton's expression hardened. "Then that's their choice. I have orders to pacify this region, and that's what I intend to do." The campaign began in early October, with crisp autumn air and leaves turning gold and red across the forest. Thornton organized his force into 4 companies of 50 men each, planning to enter the valley from multiple directions simultaneously. It was textbook military strategy, the kind that had won battles across 2 continents. I went with the main force, along with Harrison and Miller. We'd been assigned as scouts and advisors, expected to provide intelligence and guidance. What we actually provided were warnings that no one wanted to hear. The first day went smoothly. Too smoothly. We encountered abandoned structures, cleared fields, signs of recent habitation, but no Folers. They'd vanished into the valley like smoke, leaving behind only empty buildings and unsettling symbols. "Where are they?" Thornton demanded, studying his maps. 200 people can't simply disappear." "They haven't disappeared," I said. "They're watching, waiting for the right moment. Then we'll give them a moment they won't like." Thornton ordered the structures burned. His soldiers set fire to the bone buildings, the grotesque constructions of the Foler family. The flames rose high, smoke billowing into the gray sky. It should have been satisfying, destroying the monuments to their twisted culture. Instead, it felt like provocation. That night, the attacks began. They came in the darkest hours, when exhaustion had dulled even the most alert sentries. Not in waves or charges, but as silent infiltrations. Soldiers stationed at the perimeter simply disappeared, taken without sound or struggle. By morning, we'd lost 12 men with barely any indication of how. Thornton was furious and frustrated. How are they doing this? Where's our perimeter security? They're better at moving in darkness than anyone you've ever faced, Harrison said. They've been hunting in this valley their entire lives. To them, we're loud and clumsy, easy to track and ambush. Then we adjust. Tighter perimeters, more frequent patrols, better lighting. We tried everything Thornton suggested, but the casualties continued. The Folers adapted to every change in our tactics, finding new vulnerabilities, exploiting every moment of weakness. They were patient, methodical, and absolutely ruthless. On the third day, we found one of the missing soldiers. Or rather, we found what was left of him. He'd been positioned on the trail ahead of us, arranged in a way that ensured we'd see him from a distance. The message was clear. This is what happens to invaders. The effect on morale was devastating. These weren't combat deaths, weren't casualties from honest battle. They were murders, carefully staged to maximize psychological impact. Soldiers began jumping at shadows, firing at movement that turned out to be wind-blown branches. "We need to withdraw," Miller urged Thornton. "Regroup and develop a different strategy." "Absolutely not. We haven't even engaged their main force yet. We're not retreating from a rabble of degenerates." But Thornton's confidence was shaking. I could see it in his face, in the way he constantly checked our position on the maps. He'd expected resistance, but not this. Not an enemy that struck from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. On the fourth night, they launched their real attack. It started with fire. Arrows wrapped in burning cloth shot from the darkness, setting tents and supplies ablaze. As soldiers rushed to fight the flames, the Folers struck. They came from multiple directions, moving through the chaos with terrifying efficiency. I caught glimpses of them in the firelight, the twisted forms I'd seen before but now moving with purpose and coordination. They fought with knives and clubs, with thrown weapons with their bare hands. And they were devastatingly effective. Thornton tried to organize a defense, but the darkness and confusion made formation impossible. It became a series of individual struggles, soldiers fighting desperately against enemies they could barely see. Harrison fought beside me, his earlier swagger replaced by grim determination. "Fall back to the river," he shouted. "Defensible position." We retreated in chaos, losing more men with every step. The Folers pursued, but didn't overextend, content to drive us from their territory rather than risk their own people in prolonged combat. By dawn, we'd lost 40 soldiers, nearly a quarter of our force, gone in one night. The survivors were exhausted, demoralized, and terrified. This wasn't the glorious military campaign they'd expected. It was a nightmare. Thornton called a council of officers. His face was haggard, his uniform torn and blood-stained. "We need to reassess," he said, the admission clearly painful. "This enemy is more capable than intelligence suggested." "We tried to tell you," I said, unable to keep the bitterness from my voice. "The Folers aren't going to fight by rules you understand. They're defending their home, their bloodline, everything they believe in, and they'll sacrifice anything to win. What do you recommend?" "Withdraw. Return to the garrison, report that the valley can't be taken without unacceptable casualties. Recommend containment instead of conquest. That's surrender. That's survival. Sir, they know this valley intimately. Every tree, every ravine, every hiding place, they've been training for this their entire lives. We're fighting on their terms, in their territory, against an enemy that doesn't have supply lines to cut or morale to break. We can't win this." Thornton was silent for a long moment, staring at the maps that had proved so useless. Finally, he nodded. "We withdraw at dawn. Organized retreat, covering each other. Leave nothing useful behind." But the Folers had one more lesson to teach us. As we prepared to march out the next morning, we discovered that during the night they'd surrounded our position. Not to attack, but to deliver a message. Trees around our camp had been carved with symbols and words. The same phrases I'd seen in their structures. "Keep the blood pure. This land is ours." And hanging from branches were objects that made my blood run cold. clothing and equipment from soldiers who died in previous patrols, arranged in chronological order. A timeline of everyone who'd tried to enter the valley and failed. At the end of the display, left ominously empty, were dozens of ropes waiting for new additions. The message was unmistakable. Leave now, or join the collection. We left. The retreat took 2 days, moving as quickly as exhaustion and caution allowed. The Folers followed at a distance, never attacking but making sure we knew they were there. They didn't need to fight anymore. They'd proven their point. Of the 200 soldiers who entered Foler Valley, only 143 returned. 57 dead, more wounded, all defeated not by superior numbers or weapons, but by an enemy that understood their own ground better than any invading force possibly could. Thornton wrote his report at the garrison, his hand shaking slightly as he documented the campaign's failure. I watched him age years in those few days, his confidence replaced by haunted knowledge of how badly he'd underestimated the enemy. "They're not human," he said quietly as we reviewed the casualty lists. "Not anymore. Whatever they were once, generations of isolation and inbreeding have created something else. They're still human," I corrected. "That's what makes them so dangerous. They have human intelligence, human planning ability, human determination. But they've bred themselves for a specific purpose, surviving in that valley at any cost. What do we do about them?" "Exactly what I recommended months ago. Contain them. Don't let anyone enter the valley. Don't send any more soldiers to die. Post guards, maintain the garrison but leave them alone. Eventually the genetic problems from inbreeding will weaken them. But that's a solution measured in decades, not days." Thornton's report to Congress was blunt and detailed. He held nothing back, documenting every failure, every casualty, every way the campaign had gone wrong. He recommended immediate abandonment of any plans to pacify or settle Foler Valley. This time, Congress listened. The official response came in the winter of 1781. Foler Valley was to be declared off-limits to civilian settlement. The garrison at Redemption Creek would be maintained and reinforced. Military patrols would monitor the perimeter, but not enter the valley proper. In effect, the government was acknowledging defeat and choosing containment over confrontation. It was the right decision, but it came at the cost of 57 lives. I remained at the garrison through that first winter, helping to establish proper defensive procedures and training new soldiers on the realities of their assignment. The work was necessary, but it was also a form of penance. I'd tried to warn them, but not hard enough. I'd let them walk into a meat grinder because I couldn't find the right words to make them understand. Reverend Hutchins continued his ministry to the soldiers and the few settlers in the area. His earlier pessimism had transformed into a kind of grim acceptance. The valley had claimed many lives over the decades. These were just the latest. "They'll stay contained now," he asked me one evening. "For a while, maybe a generation. But eventually people will forget. They'll look at maps and see valuable land going unused. They'll convince themselves the stories are exaggerated, and they'll try again. And the same thing will happen. Probably. Unless something changes with the Folers themselves. If the inbreeding finally catches up to them, if disease or famine reduces their numbers significantly, then maybe the threat diminishes. But as long as they remain strong, the valley stays closed." In the spring of 1782, I finally left Redemption Creek. My work there was done, or as done as it was ever going to be. The garrison was functioning, the perimeter established, the procedures documented. Other surveyors would map the surrounding territories, carefully avoiding the one place that couldn't be mapped. Before I left, I visited the valley one last time. Not entering it, just standing on the ridge where I'd first observed the Foler settlement. The structures we'd burned had been rebuilt, already returning to their grotesque former state. Smoke rose from cooking fires. People moved between buildings. Life continued there, as it had for generations, as it probably would for generations more. The Folers had won their valley, held it against the full force of the Continental Army. They'd proven they could defend their territory, their bloodline, their twisted vision of perfection. And as I watched, a figure emerged from one of the buildings. Even at this distance, I recognized her. Sarah, the woman who'd first warned me away. She looked up toward my ridge, as if she knew I was there. Then she raised one hand in a gesture that could have been greeting or farewell. I didn't wave back. I simply turned and walked away, leaving the valley to its darkness. The story of Folers Valley faded from public consciousness over the following years. New wars, new frontiers, new concerns occupied the growing nation. The garrison at Redemption Creek became a quiet backwater posting, manned by soldiers who'd done something to anger their superiors or who wanted to escape civilization for a while. I returned to my cartography work, mapping safer territories, helping to build the young nation's knowledge of its own lands. But I never forgot the valley or the people who inhabited it. I kept my notes, my sketches, my observations, not for publication, but as a record. A warning for future generations who might not believe such things were possible. In my later years, I sometimes wondered what became of the Folers. Did they continue their experiment in selective breeding? Did they eventually succumb to the genetic problems that plague all isolated populations? Or did they thrive, becoming even more adapted to their valley, even more dangerous to any who dared enter? I never went back to find out. Some questions are better left unanswered. But I do know this. In the depths of the Pennsylvania wilderness, in a valley that appears on no maps and bears no official name, there lives a family that chose a different path for humanity. They traded diversity for purity, civilization for isolation, progress for preservation. And they paid for it with their humanity, piece by piece, generation by generation, until all that remained was a twisted reflection of what people could become when they turned their backs on everything that makes us human. The Folers are still there. The valley still stands. And the warning remains the same as it was in 1781. Stay away. Some places aren't meant to be mapped. Some families aren't meant to be saved. And some darkness, once planted deep enough, grows roots that can never be pulled free. That is the legacy of Folers Valley. Not a tale of monsters or supernatural evil, but something far more disturbing. A reminder that humanity contains within itself the seeds of its own corruption. Given isolation, given purpose, given enough time and terrible determination, we can breed ourselves into nightmares. The Folers are not a family. They are a warning, and we would do well to heed it. My final words on this matter, written now as an old man far removed from those terrifying events, are simple. The map I was sent to make remains incomplete. Folers Valley is marked only with the words, "Forbidden territory, do not enter." It is the most accurate map I ever created. For some places, the only honest cartography is a warning. The only true knowledge is to know what must never be known. And the only wisdom is to recognize that not all boundaries should be crossed, not all territories should be claimed, and not all families should survive. The Folers chose their path. They walked it with dedication and terrible purpose. And they created something that should never have existed, in a place that should have remained unmapped forever. God have mercy on anyone who forgets that lesson. Joe, now I don't have good news. I love to produce these videos, but creating them takes me a lot of time, and the only way I have to continue is to reach 1,000 subscribers, because this way I start receiving from YouTube. If you like our stories, don't let this channel die. Sign up and share our videos. For this I am grateful.